What's up guys, it's Brad from LightArchitect here. In this video, I'm going to be showing how you can create this jet flyby effect inside of Blender. I'll be showing you how you can 3D track your live action shot, animate your 3D jet, and then finally we'll be adding a very basic Afterburner style glow effect, as well as some particle systems to create some contrails and smoke. This is one of my favorite shots to do because you can use it to create some high production value for your films or animations, and it's fairly simple to do. Anyways guys, let's get started. Here we are inside of Blender. As usual, we'll just delete everything in our scene here. And now we're going to go to our visual effects tab here, and we'll go to motion tracking. Now we will open up the footage that we want to add our jet to. So go ahead and navigate to whatever that file is for you. Go ahead and open it here, and as I mentioned in previous videos, you can use an image sequence if you want. However, I've never had any problems using some basic MP4 files for my 3D tracking process. So this is our shot we're going to be adding the jet to. The first thing I want to do is just click on set scene frames here so that Blender automatically sets the animation timeline to this live action shot here. So I'll go ahead and click here. And I also want to prefetch our shot so that Blender doesn't buffer as we play through our timeline here. So now all of the frames in our video are prefetched into the Blender timeline, so Blender doesn't have to search for them, and it just speeds up the process a bit better. And as you can see here, since we set the scene frames, we have 467 frames on our timeline here. So I'm going to actually try to shorten that just so we don't have to track as much of our footage, but feel free to use as much of the shot as you like. I'll just kind of scroll through our timeline here and choose the part of our footage that I want to end our shot on. I'll just end our shot at maybe frame 400. And that should be pretty good. Alright, so this is going to be a fairly simple shot to track. As you can see here, the camera movement is from a drone flying over a city here, and it's pretty stable, so we should be able to just detect the features and track it fairly quickly here. But if you want to know a more advanced way to track your shot, I will put a link to a more advanced 3D tracking tutorial in the description below, as I've done before. Alright, so I'm going to go to the beginning of our timeline here, and I want to change our tracking settings here to blurry footage. Then I will just click on detect features, and as you can see here, Blender is going to give us a whole bunch of tracking points across our image, and if you need to add more, you can decrease the threshold here and Blender will automatically add more tracking points throughout your scene. But this should be pretty good. I'm just going to click on this track forward button here while all of our markers are selected, and Blender will go through our scene and track these markers. Alright, so now that we have tracked these markers from the beginning of our image, I'm going to click on detect features again, and now I'm going to track these markers backwards using this track markers backwards button right here. And now I'm going to go to the middle of our timeline here, click on detect features again, and we're going to track these markers forward and then also track them backward all the way to the beginning of our shot. Alright, so generally you need 8 tracking markers throughout your shot in various areas of depth throughout your scene. So we should have enough tracking data for Blender to calculate our camera movement. Let's go to our right window here and go ahead and add a camera. So I'll go ahead and press Shift A, and we will add a camera here. And now we'll go to our Solve tab here, and I want to select the keyframe options so that Blender automatically chooses the tracking marker keyframes where the most parallax is occurring in our shot. And then I also want to refine the focal length of our shot here. And this should be pretty good. Now I'm just going to click on Solve Camera Motion, and we'll see what Blender gives us for our solve error. Alright, so Blender is giving us a solve error of 7.41 pixels, which is not terrible, but is definitely not good enough. I try to get this solve error below 1 pixel. Sometimes 2 is alright as well. It just kind of depends on the shot. It also told me down here before I restarted the screen recording that some data failed to reconstruct. So we do need to kind of refine our track here a bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to our cleanup tab here. I'll click on clean tracks, and then I want to increase the reprojection error a bit here. And what we're going to do here is we're going to select all of our tracking points with a tracking error of, let's say, 7.17 and above. So it's just going to select those points of a higher than 7.17 projection error. And I'm just going to click on X and delete those really quick. And now I'm going to go ahead and select all of our keyframes once again. Let's just kind of scroll through our timeline, make sure our tracking points are sticking fairly well, at least by eye here. So it's looking pretty good. Now I'm just going to click on Solve Camera Motion again, and let's see what we get now that we've cleaned some tracking data. Alright, so now for whatever reason our solve error is even higher. It's saying 38.29 pixel errors, which is not good at all, but we're going to troubleshoot it a bit here. But as I mentioned, if your error is below 2 or even better 1, you should be good to go. But I'm going to solve this issue here. So what I'm going to do is actually manually select our keyframe A and keyframe B here with the most parallax in our shot. So I'll go ahead and deselect our keyframe option, and I'm just going to kind of scroll through our timeline here and choose the keyframes with the most parallax. I think probably frame 286 to 376 maybe. I'll try that. 286, and then we'll try maybe 320 just so that it's a little bit shorter there. And just make sure all of our tracking markers are generally where they should be. It's looking fairly good here. I'm not sure what the issue is going to be here, but let's try this out. Go ahead and click on solve camera motion again and see what we get. Alright, so that worked out pretty well. As you can see here, I have a solve error of 0.68 pixels, which is below 1, so we should be good to go. So now what we're going to do is we're going to add this camera motion to our camera and set up our tracking scene. So first I'll scroll down here to our scene setup tab. I'll click on set as background. And now, as you can see here, our video clip is in the background of our camera view here, which is helpful when you're adding all of your elements together or recreating the geometry of your scene. And now I will also set the origin of our camera. So wherever we want the 000 point of our 3D world to be. So I'm going to click on this point right here, right along the Los Angeles River here, and click on set origin. And now, as you can see here in our right camera view, the origin is set where this point would be. And one more thing we can do is actually set the floor of our scene. So we can select maybe 3 points along the general ground of our scene here, maybe one over here, and kind of a little triangle where our floor would be. And then I'll click on floor. And now, as you can see here, our 3D world is a little bit better aligned for this live action shot. And of course, you can adjust your camera and 3D scene accordingly, but this is just a nice way to set up that in a way that is fairly close to your live action shot. Alright, so before we go back to layout mode, I also want to set the scale of our scene. So what we can do here is I'll just select 2 different points here. So I'm going to say these 2 points here are about 10 meters apart in the real world. So I will select both of them and select our distance here. We'll make this 10. And then we'll click on set scale. And now, as you can see here in our right panel here, our grid now matches the scale of this live action shot, generally based on the distance that we provided it. Alright, so now that we have tracked our camera, it's time to go to layout mode and add our jet to the scene. So go ahead and click on layout here, and I will also separate this window here so we have 2 different windows. I'll go to our view panel in this right window and go to viewpoint camera. And as you guys probably know, if you watch this channel, this is the way I like to work when generally designing our scenes here, and it's just so that we can kind of see the 3D world in this left panel while seeing through our camera and what we're going to render on this right view here. So I'll go ahead and select our camera here, and I actually forgot to set up our tracking scene. So as you can see here, if I play through our shot, our camera is not moving. So we need to go back to our motion tracking tab and set that up real quick. So I'll click on motion tracking, and finally we'll just click on setup tracking scene. And as you can see here, if we go back to layout mode and enable our motion tracking data, you can see all of our different tracking points as 3D points in our scene. And Blender has also added some collections for us, as well as some view layers and compositing nodes that we'll work with later. But I'll go ahead and just play through our shot here really quick. As you can see, our tracking markers are pretty much where we want them to be, and our 3D camera is successfully tracked and moving through 3D space according to the way the live action camera has filmed this shot. So we're doing pretty good here. Alright, so in the process of setting up our tracking scene and clicking on that button, Blender has imported a basic cube here in the foreground collection, as well as a background ground plane as a shadow catcher in the scene. And we don't actually need our cube here because we're going to be actually adding a jet to our foreground layer. So I'll go ahead and delete our cube here. And now what I want to do is actually select our ground plane here, and we're going to scale this up so that it fills up our environment. And the reason we want this here is not necessarily to catch shadows, but is rather to make sure that the indirect lighting from below our jet kind of matches our live action shot. So we're going to actually make this plane the general color of our ground here, or you could even reproject an image of the city here if you want to be even more accurate, if you have a very reflective 3D model, for example. But for this specific tutorial, we'll just be making this ground plane the general color of the ground of our city here to make that indirect lighting a little bit more accurate. I'll go ahead and just scale it up here and make sure it's big enough for our city. And as you can see, when we play through our scene, it's just kind of a very basic ground plane in our city. And because it is a shadow catcher, it won't actually be rendered as a solid in our scene. Alright, so now that we've kind of generally placed our ground plane here, let's select the color for it to be in our scene. So while our ground plane here is selected, I'll go to our material tab and I'll click on new. And I just want to click on this base color option, use the eyedropper tool, and I'm just going to select a portion of our live action ground here. And now this plane will be this dark kind of bluish color, which should be nice to simulate the indirect lighting from below our jet. All right, so now let's import our 3D jet and animate it throughout our shot. I'm going to use a jet modeled by Chris Kuhn and downloaded from BlendSwap. It's an F18 model that's fairly high poly, but you can use any 3D jet of your choice. So I'll just append it here with our append option. And I'll just select all of our objects here for the file and append them. And now, as you can see here, a 3D jet has entered our scene along with some planes that we don't really want that are lighting our jet. So I'll go ahead and delete some of these here. You know, we have some lights here that we don't want and another camera that we don't want. So the cool thing about this jet model is that we already have an empty attached to it, so it's very easy to animate everything from this empty. But of course, if you don't have that, you'll have to animate the entire jet. One thing that might be helpful if you're going to do that is just selecting your entire jet and then joining your geometry. Just so that it's all one piece and you don't have to worry about parenting everything together. But we're just going to animate the jet using this empty here. So I'll just kind of position our jet by our camera here, and we just want to kind of rotate it and generally position where we want it to come into our shot. Something like this probably. I might scale it up a little bit and even rotate it along the x-axis. And to rotate it, I'm just pressing R and then X, Y, or Z to rotate it on each different axis. So I'm liking this frame right here. So now what we can do is actually go to the beginning of our timeline. I'll go ahead and play through our timeline here. We don't want the jet coming into the beginning of our shot, but we want there to be kind of a beat before it comes in. So I'm thinking around maybe frame 160 is where we want our jet to come in, maybe just past 160. So what I'll do is I'll select our 3D jet empty here that we're using to animate our jet. I'll press G and then X to bring it back here. I'll press I and then I'll insert a keyframe for the location, rotation, and scale. And then I will go to frame, let's see here, maybe 4 seconds later. We want our jet to be pretty deep into the background. So what would that be, about maybe around frame 260? It's pretty far off into the distance. So while our jet is selected here at frame 260, I'll press G and X again, and we'll just push our jet way off here in the background, something like this. And I also might actually press R and X twice and then rotate it a little bit, just so there's a little bit of rotation from start to finish here. And then I'll again press I. I'll insert another keyframe for location, rotation, and scale. And now we have, as you can see here, if I play through our shot, our jet flies by our scene here. And theoretically, this could actually work, but I'm going to try to tweak it a bit more to get a little bit nicer result. And of course, we're going to add those particle systems and that Afterburner effect. So let's tweak this animation to make it a little bit more realistic and then add those effects as well. So the first thing I'm going to do is maybe add a little bit of rotation, maybe in between our start and end keyframe here. So maybe around here, I'll press R and then X twice, and then maybe rotate it a little bit and press I again, give it another location, rotation, and scale keyframe. And now, as you can see here, our jet is rotating a little bit, and we actually might want our jet to be rotated a little bit the other way at the beginning portion of our timeline here, something like this. I'll press I again, location, rotation, and scale. And let's see here, now it's a little bit too sudden there. I might delete this keyframe here, so I'll press X to delete that one. And I'll rotate this keyframe at 209. I'll rotate it a little bit on the x-axis and press I again, add another location, rotation, scale keyframe. And, you know, this is looking pretty cool. So this is just a matter of your own personal taste here. Again, you can be as precise or imprecise as you like. I do recommend keyframing the start and end point of your jet first, and then, you know, kind of tweaking in between those 2 points. It just seems to be a little bit more easy to animate in a more organic way if you already have those 2 starting points set up for yourself. But anyways, this should be a pretty good animation for our jet. One thing I'm going to do is actually go into our graph editor here, and under channel and extrapolation mode, I'm going to select linear extrapolation. And the reason for that is because in its former state, without selecting that linear extrapolation mode, Blender was slowly increasing the speed of the jet as the animation started and slowly decreasing the speed of the jet as the jet animation was approaching its end frame. Now our jet is going to be moving constantly throughout our scene and will actually even continue moving after our final keyframe, because this is the way that Blender extrapolates the animation. Alright, so before we add our Afterburner effect and particle systems for the contrails, I want to do one quick viewport render animation so that we make sure that our animation is looking good in real-time playback. So what I'm going to do is I'll go to our output tab here. I'll decrease the resolution to maybe 50%, and I'll just choose an output for our preview animation here. I'll just call this Jet Flyover Tutorial. And we'll call this Jet Flyover Tutorial Animation and accept. And we'll change this to an OpenEXR file format. And now on our right side here, I'll click on View and Viewport Render Animation. And now Blender will go through all of the frames in our timeline, and then we'll be able to play it back in real time and make sure our animation is what we want. Alright, so Blender has gone through all of our keyframes here. We can close our window and then go to Render and View Animation. And now as you can see here, we can view our animation in real time. And we can see our jet flying by here. I think it looks okay, but I think it's going a little bit slow. So what I might do is just close our window here, select our jet animation here, our jet empty that we've animated, and I'll select all the keyframes here, and then I'll press S and then scale them down a bit so that it will move just a little bit faster, you know. That's going a little bit too quick probably. Let's try maybe something like this. Alright, I think that's probably pretty solid, but of course you can adjust this later, but we want to try to make sure that our particle systems look good with our general animation. But this is looking pretty solid. Feel free to tweak it to your liking. But now let's go ahead and add an HDR environment to light up our jet, and then we're going to add our glowing afterburners. So first I'll just go to our world tab here. I'll go to our this little color button here, and we'll click on environment texture. And what I want to do is I just want to use a basic HDRI that matches our general environment. I don't have a picture of this exact environment, but if you just find kind of a general city HDRI with some similar colors in the sky and ground, it should be good enough for this kind of shot. So I'll just click on open here, and I'll find one that I've downloaded, and I'll open it here. And now as you can see here, if I go to rendered view on this side, actually I need to switch to cycles really quick. So I need to go to our render properties tab here. We'll switch this to cycles, and then we also want to go to our film tab and make sure it is selected as transparent so that we're not rendering our HDRI as well, but it is lighting our jet. So I'll go ahead and go to render view now, and let's see what we get. Alright, so this is looking pretty solid. As you can see, we have some nice soft light on our jet here, and it's matching generally our background. It's a little bit bright, but we can bring that down in the compositing process, or maybe we can just go to our environment world settings here and maybe decrease the strength to 0.75, and now it's looking a little bit better. And yeah, this should be pretty good. One thing I should mention is you should make sure that your jet is in your foreground collection here rather than your background collection, because your background collection is just for your shadow catcher and ground plane. But yeah, now let's add our afterburner glowing effect here. So I'll go back to solid mode here, and what I want to do is just add a very basic circle. So I'll go to solid view, I'll press Shift A, and we'll add a circle, and it's going to be in the middle of our scene here. It's down here, but we want to make sure that it is filled with a, we'll try just an N-gon. And here it is. It's just a very basic circle here, and I'm going to use this as our glowing afterburner effect. So I'll just drag it over closer to our jet here, and we'll just rotate it 90 degrees on the x-axis, and then rotate it around on the z-axis, and we'll scale it down. And we want to just place this right in our engines here. So I'll press G and just grab it, put it right in our engine here. And obviously this is not the most precise way to do this, but it works. Just kind of doing it by eye here. All right, something like that is pretty solid. And now I'm going to go to edit mode, and I'll select all of our vertices here and press Shift D, duplicate these vertices and drag them over to our second engine right here. Then I'll just go to object mode again and make sure these are small enough. So we have something like this right now. So now what we're going to do is we're going to add a material to make these glow like they're an afterburner. So while these are selected, I'll go to our material tab, click on new material, and we'll change the surface to an emission material. And we'll change the color to maybe kind of a orangish color, and then increase the strength maybe to 100. And now as you can see here, if I go to rendered view, we have kind of a glowing afterburner effect, which is a nice touch for our jet. And I might actually make this a little bit more saturated to give us a little bit more heat or something. But this is looking pretty solid. What we want to do is parent these afterburner effects to our jet. But first I'll just relabel them here. Right now it's just labeled as a circle, so we'll call it Afterburner. And then I'll select our afterburner and then press shift and select our jet body here, and I'll press Control P and set the parent to an object. And now as our jet is animated, our afterburner that we've just added will move along with it, so it will be animated as well. All right, so we're moving along here. Now it's time to add a particle system to create the contrails of our jet. I want to add this contrail particle system to the edge of our wing here. I'm going to select our 3D cursor here where our wing is, and I'm going to press Shift A. We'll just add a Icosphere, and we'll just scale it way down here and put it at the edge of our wing here. Something like this probably is just fine. Again, you can be more precise if you'd like. And we're going to label this, we'll call it Contrail Particle System 1. And we're going to select that and then select our missile here, and I'll press Control P and parent this to our missile. And now we'll select our Icosphere for our particle system, and we'll go to our particle system tab and we'll add a new particle system. And now as you can see here, if I play through our timeline, we have this kind of particle system that's attached to the wing of our jet. It's not doing exactly what we want it to do because gravity is affecting it too much, but it's a good start. So we'll go ahead and go back to our particle system settings here, and I want to increase the number of particles that are being emitted. So I'll change this to maybe 5,000. For the lifetime of our particles, I'll increase this to maybe try 300. And for the end frame of our emission of the particles, I'll make this all the way to 400 so they last the entire length of our timeline. Then under velocity, we'll keep this at 1. I might give it a little bit of randomize here, 0.5 maybe. And finally, under our field weights settings, we want to go to gravity and turn this to 0. And now if we play through our scene here, let's see what we get. Alright, so pretty solid. It's a little bit too random here, so I'm going to actually turn down the randomize here to 0, and let's try it again. And I actually think the issue is our normal is a little too high, so I'll maybe change the normal to 0.05, and I'll increase the randomize to 0.05 as well. And now we'll try it again. And we're just trying to dial in the general shape of the contrails. This is looking pretty solid. We got some nice trailing particles here. I might increase the randomize a little bit to maybe 0.08. But yeah, this should be pretty good. So now what we want to do, now that we've actually created our particle system, is we actually want to attach an object to the particle system so that we can render it as a contrail rather than a random particle. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a very basic icosphere. So I'll press Shift A. We'll go to icosphere, and we'll just put this icosphere off to the side here so it's not being rendered in our scene. I'll scale it up a bit so we can see it. We'll go ahead and relabel it. We'll call it Contrail Particle. And I'll go to our material settings and add a new material for this. And we want to switch this to principled volume shader is what we want. And I'll go to our shading tab here. For whatever reason, our particle is dark here. I'm not sure why. Ah, I know why. So right now we need to move this volume output to our volume input and then take it away from our surface. And now it's just going to be a volume shader, which is exactly what we want. And I'll bring down the density to maybe 0.25. Not sure why it's so bright here. Let's see. I'll press Shift A. We'll add an input, RGB. Okay, so for whatever reason it was emitting light here, but it shouldn't have been doing that. So this is actually what we want. So we can just turn the emission off, and now we just have a very basic volumetric shader here, and I'll just increase the brightness of it a bit so it's a little brighter. And now we're going to instance this contrail particle on our contrail particle system. So I'll go back to our layout mode again and select our contrail particle system, and under our particle system settings I'll scroll down here to render, and instead of render as halo we'll switch to as an object, and then instance the contrail particle object. And now as you can see here we have a whole bunch of little contrail particles in our scene, and I might increase the scale randomness for a little bit of variation, and maybe just increase the general size of it as well, and maybe also increase the number of these particles to maybe 10,000. And now let's play through our scene again and let's see what we get. Alright, pretty solid. I might bring down the scale a little bit to 0.04, and I'm going to go to render view really quick and let's see what we're looking like. Alright, so as you can see here, we have a nice little contrail particle system here. It's not totally perfect, but we'll keep tweaking the settings till we dial it in a bit more. So maybe we'll select our particle system, we'll decrease the scale randomness a bit to maybe 0.25, so they're just a bit more uniform. Now it's looking a lot better. Bring down the scale here to 0.02. But anyways, this is the general concept, and we can keep tweaking the settings, but I think this is looking pretty solid now. There we go. And let's see what we're looking like. Yeah, I think this is looking pretty good. We could select our contrail particle, maybe go to its material settings. Under volume, maybe increase the density a bit to 0.6. And now it's a much more dense contrail, which is a nice touch. And then under our particle settings for our particle system here, under render, we'll deselect the show emitter option so that we don't actually see the object that's emitting these particles. And that should be a much better result for us. All right, so now what we're going to do is we're going to duplicate our contrail particle system and place it on this side of our wing here. So I'll press Shift D and we'll duplicate it, and I'll just drag it to our other wing here, and we'll just kind of place it by eye here right on the edge of our wing. Again, you can be more precise if you want, but I think this should be pretty solid. And now let's play through this system, and let's make sure that we have two different contrails for our jet. And there we go. Now we have two different contrails, and we have a little bit of spaces there, but you could keep adjusting your settings if you want, or this might look kind of cool. All right, so now that we have set up our contrail particle system here, let's actually create the particle system for some black smoke coming from our afterburner here. So instead of setting up an entirely new particle system, I'm just going to select one of our old particle systems here, and I'll press Shift D, duplicate it, place it by our afterburner here, kind of generally, and just make sure it's kind of generally where we want it, just kind of generally by our afterburner here. And then I'm going to click on this button to make some new particle settings for this particle system. And then I'm going to actually, under instance object, I'm going to change this to a new particle. So I'm going to click on our contrail particle, I will Shift D, duplicate it, and we'll rename this one Afterburner particle. And under our material settings, I will duplicate the material. We'll go to rendered view, and we just want to make it a little bit darker. So to do that, what we'll do is under our color settings, we'll just bring down the brightness of this particle. And now as you can see here, we have a darker volumetric shader for this afterburner particle here. All right, so now we'll go back to our afterburner particle system here. We'll select it, and we'll go to our particle settings tab, and under our instance object, we'll switch this to afterburner particle. Go back to solid mode, take a look through our camera, and play through our scene, see what we're getting so far. Alright, so we have another particle system here, which is doing exactly what the other particle systems are doing. So we want to adjust that a bit. So I'm going to first increase the render size of our instance object here. So maybe 0.08. So now it's a little bigger. And then I also want to decrease the lifetime of these particles to maybe, we'll say 200. And then lifetime randomness I'll increase as well. And now let's see what we're getting. Something like that is not bad. As you can see, if we go to render view really quick, you can see kind of the black smoke here in the middle, which is what we're creating with that afterburner effect. And it's a little bit dark here, but what you can do is in the compositing process, you can bring that opacity down so it's not quite as prevalent in your scene. And of course, if you want to add more detail to this, you can make smaller contrail particles and instance a lot more of them so that there's a lot more detail in your smoke. But in my opinion, this should be pretty good. Once we add a little bit of compositing and blur and everything, it should be just fine. All right, so I might select our particle system really quick here for our afterburner. I'm just going to decrease the lifetime to maybe 100. or maybe even 50, just so it doesn't last quite as long. And as you can see, it starts fading off quicker, which in my opinion is kind of nice. And I'm not sure what's going on here with these particles. Let's go ahead and adjust a few of our settings to make sure we're not getting these glitches. Under randomize, we'll turn this all the way off to 0, and let's see what we get now. Alright, much better. Now we have a much cleaner look, and this should be good for our contrails as well as our afterburner smoke. Alright guys, so finally, now what we're going to do is we're going to separate each of these elements in their own separate view layer so that we can composite everything together on top of the live action shot, all inside of Blender. So the first view layer that we're going to create is just for rendering our jet. So what we'll do here is we'll relabel this foreground layer, we'll call this jet. And we'll go ahead and select both of our Contrail particle systems here. I'll press M, I'll move it to a new collection. We'll call this Contrail systems. Okay, and we'll select our Afterburner smoke particle system here. Press M, move this to a new collection as well. We'll call it Afterburner system. Okay, and now I want to select the Afterburner material that we've added to our scene. So maybe I can just search for it here. We'll search for Afterburner. Here it is, Afterburner. All right, so we select that, press M, move it to a new collection. We'll call it Afterburner Glow. Okay. All right, so now as you can see here, we have our foreground, which is our jet. So I'll relabel this collection to jet. And we have our background, which is just our shadow catcher. And then we have our Contrail systems in a collection, an Afterburner system in its own collection, and then our Afterburner Glow in its own collection as well. And as I mentioned, we want just the jet to show up on this render layer. So I'll go to rendered view really quick and adjust a few of these settings. And as you can see here, we have our Contrails as well as our smoke and Afterburners all affecting this layer. So we want to get rid of those and only have them affect the jet indirectly through the lighting. So I'll go here to our filter tab here. We'll turn on all of our restrictions. I only want the jet to show up, as I mentioned, so I'll turn on indirect for all of these other collections. And now as you can see here, we just have our jet on this view layer, and our afterburners are lighting up our engines, but only indirectly, as we don't actually see them in the shot. Alright, so this jet view layer is set up now. Now we'll go ahead and add a new view layer. So I'll press add new view layer and go to new, and we'll call this one Contrail systems. And now for this view layer, we want everything else to affect our contrails indirectly, but we only want to render the contrails themselves. For our jet, I'll turn on indirect. For our background, I'll turn on indirect. For our Contrail system, I'll leave it on. For our Afterburner system, we'll turn on indirect. And for our Afterburner Glow, we'll turn on indirect as well. And now, as you can see here, the only thing being rendered in this view layer is our actual Contrail system. Now we will add a new view layer. So we'll select this, add new. We'll label this one Afterburner Smoke. And we'll do the same thing here. We'll make the jet indirect, the background indirect, the Contrail systems indirect, Afterburner system we'll leave on, and for Afterburner Glow, we will turn on indirect as well. And the cool thing about this is that our Afterburner system is actually lighting up our glow in a way that makes sense, but we don't actually see the actual element of the Afterburner, which is a nice result. All right, so finally, let's add one more view layer here for our Afterburner Glow. So I'll select add new view layer, and we'll add a new view layer here, and we'll call this one Afterburner Glow element. For our background, I'll make it indirect. For our Contrail system, I'll make this indirect. For our Afterburner system, we'll make it indirect. And for our Afterburner Glow, we'll leave it on. But for our jet, we'll actually make it a holdout layer so that our Afterburner Glow will actually be masked by our jet engine here. So as you can see, if I enable holdout here, what you see is a very simple mask around our glow element, which is very helpful in compositing our element together so that we don't have to do any manual masking in our compositing process. Alright, so now that we have set up our view layers, let's do a quick test render. Before we do a test render, however, I do want to bake all of our particle systems, so I'll just go ahead and select one of them, and I'll go to its particle settings under cache, and I want to click on Bake All Dynamics, and now all of our particle systems will be baked so that we don't have to calculate them every time we play through our timeline. And now let's go ahead and do a test render and start compositing our jet. So we'll choose a frame that we want to render here. I'm going to say maybe 165. We'll go to our render properties tab here, here and set up some render settings. For render samples, I'll maybe do 32. We'll click on adaptive sampling, and for advanced, we'll select our seed stopwatch for some noise variation. We'll scroll down here under motion blur. We'll leave it selected for some motion blur, but I want to bring the shutter down to maybe 0.12, just so there's barely a little motion blur. And this should be pretty good. Now we'll go to output. I'll increase the resolution to 100% at 1920 by 1080, and we've already set up our output for our final composite, and we want to change this to OpenEXR. And yeah, now let's go ahead and click on render and render image, and let's see what we get. Alright guys, so right out of Blender we get something like this, which is not bad, but we can definitely spice it up a bit in the compositing process. So I'll go ahead and close this window here and click on our compositing tab, and now we're going to layer all of these elements together. One thing we don't want is this background layer anymore. We actually don't need to add any drop shadow at all, so I'll go ahead and delete this, and we'll just move our jet render layer here, our output for that, into our first alpha over node, and we'll move this alpha over output to our composite as well as our viewer node, and then I'll get rid of this alpha over node, and we're going to composite each of these view layers on top of each other in a very linear workflow here. So the first thing we're going to overlay is our jet layer, which is what we see here in our final output. One thing I want to do to this jet is just bring down the brightness a bit to match it to our live action shot a bit better. So I'll go ahead and press Shift A, and we'll go to color, RGB curves, add this here, and we'll just bring down the general brightness of the jet, and already that's looking a bit better. Alright, so that's looking pretty solid. We could also add some motion blur if we want, but I think it's looking pretty good once we add everything else to it. You can add some other color correction as well, but I don't think we really need it. So now what we're going to do is we're going to add another alpha over node. So I'll press Shift D and duplicate this one, and we'll bring this output to our composite. And now I want to duplicate our render layer input, so I'll press Shift D, duplicate this, and we'll add this to our alpha over node. And I want to change the view layer on this render layer input to Afterburner glow element, and now as you can see here we have a nice glow element overlaid on top of our Afterburner, which is exactly what we want. And we will just go ahead and press Shift A, and we want to add a little bit of glow to this element here. So I'll go ahead and press Shift A and go to filter, glare, add this to our Afterburner glow element input, and we want to change this mode to fog glow, and then we'll change the quality to high. And honestly, that's looking pretty good. You know, it's a little bit bright. Depending on how stylistic you want to make it, you may want to dial this down a bit. You could add a RGB curves node, bring down the brightness a bit so it's not quite as prevalent in the scene, something like that. Actually, I kind of like that better. It's a little more orange, and it's a little bit too orange probably, so perhaps we can add a hue saturation value node here, bring down the saturation to 0.6, and you know, that's a little too much actually. Maybe 0.85, you know, that's not bad. Maybe 0.95. Maybe decrease the size of the glow a bit to 6, actually increase the size to 9. Alright, this is a pretty nice looking result. It might be a little hot, but you know, you can always bring it down with the RGB curves and get a slightly different result. But this is the general concept. Now we're going to add the Contrails view layer. So once again, I will duplicate this alpha over node. So I'll press Shift D, and we'll add it to our view node and output it to our composite. I will press Shift A, we'll add an input, render layers, and move this image to our alpha over node and change the view layer to Contrail systems. And now as you can see here, we have our nice Contrail systems overlaid on top of our live action shot. And one of the main things I can do here is actually just play around with our factor node depending on how much we want to see our contrails here. And it's also up here, but you can't really see it very well since it's in the sky. So you might want to increase the density of your volumetric particle that's attached to this particle system. But I think I'll just leave this alpha over at 1, and I might press Shift A, add a RGB curves node here, maybe increase the brightness of this contrail element a bit so that it's a little more prevalent in our scene here. Now we can see it much better. Obviously that's a little too much, but this is the general idea. Something like this is not bad. I might press Shift A, add a very basic blur node to it to blend it into the scene a bit. I might make it a bokeh blur and then increase the X value to 1 and the Y value to 1 just to give it a blur of 1 pixel. I might actually just increase this to 3 and 3. And yeah, that's looking a little bit better in my opinion. So we're gonna go with this. And one thing I should mention is for our glow, we can also play with the factor of our alpha over node. So I might just dial down the factor of this alpha over node to get a little bit less glow. And now as you can see, it's just a tiny bit less, which is I think a little bit nicer. All right, so finally let's overlay our Afterburner smoke layer and maybe give it some final color correction for our final composite. So once again, I will duplicate our alpha over node, we'll add it to our view node, export it to our final composite, and then I'll duplicate our render layer input, move our image to our alpha over bottom image input, change our view layer to Afterburner smoke. And now as you can see here, we have some nice smoke coming from our Afterburner. There's a little bit of sampling issues here, but what we can do is you can either increase the samples or we can just duplicate this blur node over here, add it to our Afterburner smoke, and that should go right away. And there you go. Now we have some nice smoke added to our scene as well. I don't actually want a lot of smoke coming from our Afterburner, so I might just decrease the factor here to 0.65, and that should decrease the amount of smoke we have coming from our Afterburner. There you go. Now it's just a pretty subtle effect, which is kind of what I'm going for. And yeah, there we have it. Now we have composited all of our different elements on top of each other using the Blender compositor. One thing we might do is just add some very basic color correction here. Give it a little bit of color correction to bring it into the shot, match everything together. And there you have it. Now what you can do to render out your final composite here to your output that you have created, you would just go to render and render animation, and Blender will render out all of your timeline that you have selected for your scene. Anyways guys, that's it for this video. I hope it was helpful. As always, feel free to leave a comment if you have any questions or suggestions in the comment section below. Let us know what kind of videos or tutorials you'd like to see next, and I'll see you next time.